Hey there, Pursuing Freedom friends. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. I've got a great show for you today. I've got Scott Trench. He is in Denver, and he is the CEO of the Bigger Pockets podcast, which is one of the greatest real estate investing podcasts, if not, it's the greatest. Let's be real. It's the greatest real estate investing podcast out there. He's also the author of a book that I was just raving about all over social media because I loved it. I consumed it in 2 days. It's called Set for Life. And it's really amazing, practical, step-by-step guide and advice for how to get going in creating passive income if early retirement is something that interests you. And why would it not? Because it would be amazing for all of us. So with no further ado, Scott, thanks for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, we're going to have some fun. I'm super excited for you to share your story. So tell us a little bit about your backstory. How'd you get into the real estate investing space and where you're at today? And we'll just kind of roll from there.
Sure. I graduated college in 2013 from Vanderbilt University. Had a couple $1,000 left over from working side gigs and stuff. My parents largely helped pay for college. So I graduated with a balance sheet close to zero. I spent the last few $1,000 on a Euro trip with a couple of buddies and started my career here in Denver at Dish Network in 2013 as a financial analyst. And within a couple of months, kind of just trying to learn about how to become a better financial analyst, how to build wealth, how to invest, those kinds of things, I stumbled across financial freedom and the concept of personal finance. And two of the biggest influencers for me in those first kind of 6 months on the job, starting in August 2013, probably discovered them around December 13 or January 2014, were Mr. Money Mustache, who, if you haven't checked him out, has a wonderful blog on frugality, just happiness and how that relates to achieving financial freedom, and then Bigger Pockets. So I began very quickly merging these two concepts. How do I save as much money as possible? And then how do I put myself in position to apply that towards real estate investing? So at the time I was making about $48,000 a year, and I was able to save, I probably started with about $3,000. And then I worked some night jobs like tutoring. I drove for Uber, those kinds of things. And over the course of a year, I was able to save about $20,000 to $25,000 on that $48,000 income plus the side hustle income. And in late 2014, I bought a house hack duplex, and that was how I got started in real estate investing. I was in probably November of 2014 when I closed in that. I bought the place for $240,000, put a down payment of $12,000 down on that property, and rented out the other unit for $1,150 and half of my unit for $550. So if you're following along so far, I'm collecting $1,700 a month in rent on a mortgage of $1,550, and that was my introduction to real estate. I actually still own that property today, and it's been a wonderful investment. It's appreciated quite a bit in the last 5-6 years here in Denver, and a great introduction to that. Since then, I've bought a couple more properties, but that's only half of the story here. The other part of the story is my journey with Bigger Pockets. So around that same time, I bought my first duplex. I also joined a mastermind. Well, March, April, May 2014, I joined a mastermind group of local investors. And I was very lucky to be there. Kind of serendipitous circumstances allowed me to join this group. And I was a little kid amongst these seasoned entrepreneurs, thought that they were so cool. And I looked up to them quite a bit. And I took each one of them out to lunch. In taking them to lunch, I actually went to a co-working space where the founder of Bigger Pockets, Joshua Dorkin, worked. I was a big fan of the website and podcast. And so I kind of fanboyed really hard all over him. I was like, oh my God, Josh, you've changed my life. I'm doing all the things you say I'm supposed to do and networking, all that kind of good stuff. Can I come work for you for free? I'll just do it on the weekends. All I want to do is get to know Bigger Pockets a little bit more and make some friends, maybe meet some investors who'll be valuable connections. He told me to go away, kid, a couple of times. I followed up a couple of times, and he invited me in for an interview as director of operations. So around the same time I bought that first duplex, I also switched jobs to work at Bigger Pockets as the director of operations or third employee.
Oh my gosh.
All these parallel things are going, and if you subscribe to my philosophy of finance, there's 4 things you can do to advance your position. 1 is spend less. 2 is earn more. 3 is invest your accumulated assets aggressively. And then the 4th is to create assets. And I was doing 3 of those things as much as I possibly could in this time period, right? I spent very little and was able to save up nearly half my income over that first year. I invested that very aggressively in a house hack. And then I changed jobs for something with significantly more potential. I sacrificed the cushy benefits and higher pay that I was going to get at my job at Dish Network for a chance at this startup. And so those are the three things I did in that kind of first year. The next 5 years have been kind of a whirlwind. I bought a couple more properties. I've steadily increased my savings rate by advancing my income, creating revenue for the company, selling, taking on additional responsibilities, those types of things. I've continued to keep my expenses low, and I've invested steadily in both index funds, and then I've accumulated another duplex, a quadplex, and I've invested in a syndication.
So that's a pretty jam-packed 7 years you've had there. So that's amazing.
Pretty exciting ride. So
I love it. So question for you. When you came out of school and immediately ended up with a job as a financial analyst, I'm guessing, did you study finance and business in college?
Yes. So I majored in economics and history, minored in corporate strategy, and minored in corporate accounting.
Okay. So do you feel like, because I know that what you teach and preach is for the everyday person making $50,000 a year who's willing to fully commit to the pursuit of financial freedom and early retirement, which is available to anyone who decides to go after it and follow your recipe. So just my only question for you is, do you feel like you had a bit of a leg up coming with that finance and accounting numbers brain? And do you find that folks that don't have that same kind of educational background have a harder time attaching to your strategy and implementing? Or have you seen success with people from all walks of life?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly had a predilection, maybe that's too big a word, maybe a desire to get good at finance since college. Like, I was impressed with some of the folks that I went to school with and their parents' achievements in a lot of cases over their careers, and I thought that finance was an important stepping stone to master. So I've always been drawn to that, and I'm a very mathematically minded person. So those are definitely qualities of mine that I think made me more interested in this maybe than some, for sure. But I don't think that the finance background itself was necessarily tied in with it, because I know a lot of finance professionals who are extremely good at FP&A and forecasting and variance analysis and conducting financial analysis and modeling out cash flow in future years, who somehow can't seem to manage their own personal finances. So I would say that they should be related in my mind, and they probably are for many, but they're not always related. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and there's no question, because I see it in real estate all the time too, is that I see folks that are very successful at generating revenue, not very successful at keeping it, investing it, and creating not necessarily an exit strategy, because not everybody wants an exit strategy, but creating financial freedom, creating security for themselves. And I think that there's this notion of I'll just create more. I can always go create more money, right? Like, go work harder and work longer. And I see the same thing in people that come out of college and go straight into finance jobs, financial analysts, et cetera, that they're making great money, but they've got nothing to show for it. Did you grow up in a household that was all that kind of instilled in you those saving money philosophy, or did you feel like you had to create that on your own?
My family, my mother and father, I think, have always been relatively responsible with money. Right. So my father is invested in his retirement accounts. I think they are well set up for a happy retirement. So I certainly did not learn bad money practices growing up. Some of the things that bugged me a little bit, and that definitely influenced me as an adult here, are things like my parents, we had a nice house and my parents drove nice cars. Yet when we went out to restaurants, they would never say this, but I always felt a little pressure to order the cheaper item on the menu, or leaving the lights on, which we should never leave the lights on. Very reasonable for my parents. All these things are very reasonable for my parents. But I kind of had the mentality, like, I don't want the nice car or the nice house, but I want to buy the $9 beer at the airport when I'm waiting for my flight, because that's going to impact my day in a lasting way. And so that's maybe the difference. One of the things that from childhood has brought me out, has impacted my finances. But really, I had a very reasonable upbringing with money.
I'm just laughing because you're like my brother from another mother, because I always felt like, I'm like, I can't spend $40 on a shirt. Are you serious? But $40 on a barbell when I'm having a good time with my friends, no, I don't even bat an eye because it's an experience. It's like, I always say I don't have anything to show for the money, except I know we're having a blast, I mean, we have
Yes,
real estate investments, of course, but not the material goods.
absolutely. I'm the same way. That's definitely like the contrast, I think, with my parents or from growing up.
Yeah. So, okay, I have a lot of questions for you here. First and foremost, seeing that you got into real estate investing and you're in Denver, which has been a blossoming market for quite some time now, pretty much the entire time that you've been in, investing in real estate, we've been seeing growth. And what are your thoughts in terms of someone who's listening? We have a lot of folks listening in the Colorado area for obvious reasons, and then, all over the country. So what are your thoughts on markets for folks that might be listening and haven't yet started to build a real estate portfolio? And is the market relevant to the success of the strategy that you particularly teach?
Wow, that's a loaded question. I want to dive into
Break
this.
that down.
I might need like 3 minutes at least to answer this question. Anyway.
Yeah, bring it.
All right. So when you're looking at a market, there's two primary factors that are going to influence your return, right? One is the long-term appreciation of that market, both in prices and rents, right? Which you think are going to largely move lockstep, right? A market that sees high price appreciation is going to also see a large amount of rent appreciation, right? Rents are going to go up. The second thing is your present day cash flow that you're going to purchase when you buy that property. Now, your present day cash flow, in my opinion, is a formula that you can compute relatively easily, right? You've got your gross rents. You subtract from your gross rents your vacancy, right? And that gives you your kind of your net revenue there. Then you're going to subtract property management fees. If you're local, you can self-manage and not incur some of those property management fees, but you should still underwrite them in case you want to have a property manager at a later point. Then you have your property taxes. You've got your property insurance, and you've got CapEx and maintenance. Okay, so of these are all pretty reasonable, easy things to compute that you can look up and find in your research. When you're looking at a market, many investors will do something very silly and very high level, which they'll say, I'm looking for a 1% rule market. Are you familiar with the 1% rule on this podcast? Yeah.
1% of you go ahead and explain it in your words because it'll sound way more eloquent than I would.
Sure. A simple way to look at that is a 1% rule property is a property where the monthly rents are 1% of the purchase price. So if it's a $100,000 home, I'd expect a $1,000 a month in rent. Right. The problem is, and then a corollary to that is I'm going to assume that my expenses, aside from financing, principal and interest, those 5 categories I just outlined, are going to be about 50% of my gross rent. So if I have $1,000 rent, I'm going to have $500 in expenses. The problem is this is really not a good way to estimate cash flow because markets around the country have vastly different property tax rates as a percentage of the purchase price and rent. They have vastly different insurance rates. And then your CapEx, and this is where a lot of smart investors disagree with me, but I'll state my opinion anyways. I think your CapEx is largely going to be the same for similar structures around the country. You take my duplex that I bought for $240,000 in Denver and you transplant it into the heart of Detroit, same structure, is worth $80,000. Is it really going to cost me 2 or 3 times as much to maintain that property, replace the fridge, the roof, whatever, here in Denver than it will in Detroit? I don't think so. I think I've got a different vacancy profile, which is highly correlated with CapEx. So when you have more turnover in a market like Detroit or Cleveland or something like that, you have to put in more money to rehab the units and get them rent ready again, right? So that's going to impact your thing. I'm going to have higher labor costs in Denver, but I want to have the same materials costs. A fridge does not cost more in Denver than it does in Detroit. So the point is, when you're choosing a market, you have to actually layer in all of these items. And what you'll find is that more expensive markets with higher rents in particular are going to actually produce a better cash on cash ROI than what you'd assume by simply applying a 1% and 50% rule. So the challenge is, and this is something that we're working on here at Bigger Pockets, we don't have the solution quite ready yet, but we're hoping to produce a study that will help investors actually make a reasonable assessment of these factors that will help you choose a market. And my suggestion is once this is out, you do some research and you look for one that's reasonably close. because I bet you that many markets are going to give you an acceptable probability of generating high cash on cash ROI or cash flow. And within that, I think that the market that is within an hour or two of you, as long as as long as it's close with some of the top markets in the country, is probably going to be your best bet as an investor. So how's that for a long-winded answer to your cash on cash ROI question?
Awesome. And yeah, and it leads me into a couple other questions. Before I go there, I'm just curious if we can do a little vocab moment, because you kind of glazed over house hack earlier, which I know what that is because I follow your podcast and I read your book. But can you tell us a little bit about house hack? And then you also talked about CapEx, so that anyone listening that may not know what those terms mean understands where we're going from here.
Sure. So a house hack is a very millennial way of phrasing the idea of buying a property as an owner occupant, so buying a home and either renting out extra bedrooms, or you can do what I did and buy a duplex and rent out the extra units. But either way, you're buying a property using owner occupant advantaged financing and then renting out portions of it to offset or completely subsidize your mortgage expense. And I think that this is probably the most impactful tool that a middle class wage earner can use on their path to generating wealth, because you can use tremendous leverage at much less risk than either your renting peer or your homeowning peer. Because even though you're using lots of leverage, like the homeowner, you have the chance to offset that mortgage with a renter. So
now, are there any pros and cons to someone investing somehow in, making alterations to the home to make that rental within their primary residence a lock off versus having to have a roommate? Because having roommates can be more attractive to the younger demographic and probably less attractive to a slightly older demographic. So does it even matter, or does it not really matter?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the financial profile of doing this, the more roommates you get and the less comfortable your living situation, generally speaking, the better your ROI. However, right. I totally buy into the fact that as you go through stages in life, you don't want to put up with that anymore, right? I'm 29. I'm doing something very different now where I've got an up-down duplex and the other unit is completely walled off for sure. And though it's someone I know very well. And I probably will not house hack again after this. I may do it one more time depending on the place. But the point of house hacking, in my opinion, is to build up a huge capital reserve, have tremendously decrease the amount of cash that you're spending on living expenses, and build up wealth very rapidly so that you don't have to do it downstream, and that housing can be funded by your previous house hacks, which are now cash flowing rental properties. So yeah, the point is not to house hack forever, but to do it for a period of 3, 5, 7 years and then be set for life.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly what my husband and I did. The sixth property we bought in 9 years was the dream home in the mountains, which, by the way, we house hack by Airbnb and VRBO the basement when we're camping on the lake or we're traveling, or if we know the
Love
person
it.
or whatever. It's just like, you don't ever have to stop looking at opportunities to generate passive income to offset your housing expense. And, a lot of our audience is real estate agents. And I just think that this conversation is so important, whether the listener is planning on building out their own real estate portfolio or not. I don't know why somebody wouldn't, but it's also important for our clients. It's important to have this information and be able to educate our clients in that way. Okay, so tell us about CapEx. What does that refer to?
CapEx is an acronym for capital expenditures. And capital expenditures are the real problem for investors and homeowners alike, right? So a capital expenditure is a large one-time or infrequent expense that goes into maintaining your property that everyone incurs. So for example, a small capital expenditure would be when your fridge needs to be replaced, you got to drop $800 to $1,200 on a new fridge or whatever it is you want to do. Right. When a bigger example might be a roof. When you have to completely redo your roof, you might have to spend 15 grand to redo that. Right. Your water heater or plumbing systems, electrical, a big remodel, updating the kitchen, whatever. These are all major capital expenditures. And the problem with capital expenditures is that they're not like a monthly fee that you incorporate, but you have to budget for them. So a good way to think about capital expenditures, or well, I don't know if it's a good way. The way I think about managing capital expenditures is I like to have a large cash reserve. So I have 15 grand for my first property. Okay. And that's just sitting in the bank as a savings account. And when on an average month, I pay my mortgage, which includes principal, interest, taxes, and insurance. I pay my property manager, and then I cash flow the rest and pocket that in the bank account. And that's most months. Every year or two for each property, something comes up where I've got to do a couple hundred or a couple $1,000s, and that depletes my capital reserve cushion below 15 grand. So let's say it's $5,000. I go down to 10, and then I wait until I pile it back up in order to begin distributing cash from my business once again, right? And for that exercise, I allocate in my head when I'm underwriting a duplex in Denver about $3,000 a year in capital reserve that I'm going to have to allocate over time. So on a monthly P&L, that would look like, hey, here's my rent of $2,000 minus $250 for CapEx and maintenance.
Sure. Perfect. Okay. So, and I know this is just probably a personal preference kind of thing, but I'm curious about your perspective on this. So, what is your personal take on how much someone should save in just a general savings account, safety net, security blanket, whatever, before they start investing in real estate, as opposed to someone who's sitting on $80,000 in a savings account because that's 12 months of expenses? And when is the time to take that risk and say, what's that 80 grand doing for you? Why don't we take 40 and put that 20% down on a $200,000 property and put that money to work for you? Or do you feel like there is a number that's like 6 months of living expenses, 12 months in a savings account before you start turning that into your investment fund?
Great question. I don't think there's a specific answer, but here's a model to think about that. If you have $80,000 in the bank and you save up $300 a month, then you are in big trouble. And that $80,000 is going to be very difficult for you to invest comfortably because it is years and years, decades of saving at your current rate. You got that money from somewhere else, whatever, right? Inheritance, whatever. If you are saving $8,000 a month and you have $80,000 in the bank, then you can be a lot more aggressive with your investing strategy. So the central unit of this entire equation of moving toward financial independence is your average monthly or annual accumulation rate of capital, right? And so and I don't have a formula for this. This is more of a model. I could probably invent some crazy formula, but really it's about that point. So if you have 80 grand in capital and you're saving up less than 1,000 or 1,500, you're gonna have to be very conservative with that capital. As you're moving from $2,000 to $5,000 a month in monthly net accumulation after tax in liquid form, then you can be much more aggressive and begin making bigger bets with that 80.
Okay. So another question I have for you is, what are your thoughts on trading up versus kind of the never sell philosophy of buy and hold? Because you are in a market where you've seen a bunch of appreciation. Are you a strong believer in just do the cash out refi on the investment property to reinvest in other properties? Or do you ever think it makes sense to cash in, if you will, to be able to leverage the equity appreciation that you've gained over the last 3, 5, 7 years, and then be able to multiply that across multiple, a number of new investments?
Absolutely. So if you are looking at this from an investing perspective, which I think you should be, how do I generate great returns from this? Then the answer will be very, very clear once I explain it. If you're not looking at this from how do I generate a lot of returns, but instead looking at this from I want to eliminate all debt in my portfolio and get to a cash flow that is very sustainable and then not have to think and just enjoy my life, disregard what I'm about to say, because then you pay off your debt. If you're looking for long-term returns, however, you're going to need to maintain a leverage position, and leverage multiplies returns. If I buy a $100,000 home with $100,000 in cash and that home appreciates by 3%, I've generated a 3% ROI. If I buy a $100,000 home with 20% down, right, then it appreciates by 3%, I now generated a 15% ROI, right? And that's excluding all the transaction costs. So bear with me on the simplicity of this, right? As you own property for a long period of time, your property is both appreciating and your loan is getting paid off. You're amortizing your loan through principal reduction on your payments. This increases your equity position and reduces your return on equity, right? Which is the number that you should be concerned with as an investor in your properties. So in order to optimize returns, Aaron, I will have to either re-leverage my properties or 1031 exchange them and buy more property and use an acceptable leverage position with that. So one way to think about this is if you could, and this is where I said I'm mathematically minded, so this might be a little overwhelming, but if you can imagine a yield curve where you get a huge performance in year one and then slowly declining performance over 30 years on a parabola, where at year 30, you have a deleveraged all cash return if you're using a 30-year mortgage, right? After about years 7 to 10 in a 3.5% appreciation market, you're not really going to get returns through real estate investing that are in excess of like a stock market investment or 8 to 10% on an average market, right?
Okay.
So to me, I have to buy consistently and then re-leverage after 7, 10 years. Again,
Okay.
either through whatever. And the second component for why you want to do this is in real estate, we can accelerate depreciation. We claim depreciation and we accelerate depreciation on capital expenditures. After 5 to 10 years, some of that depreciation begins to wear off, right? So you put a new roof in or whatever, roof's a bad example, but you put in new appliances, they might have a useful life of 10 years. Once you stop depreciating that, you're no longer getting that tax benefit.
Sure.
So there's a whole bunch of good reasons to not hold your real estate forever, but to sell and then re-leverage.
This makes me feel a lot better about myself, Scott. I'm not going to lie, because we did cash in on some properties and in order to reinvest, and I got nervous sometimes, and so you never know, right? Not that you never know what's the right thing to do, but it's good to like have these discussions and hear it from another math nerd like myself. I appreciate it very much. Okay, so one more question here I've got is what I know that on the Bigger Pockets podcast, there's a lot of talk about the Bur method, and it sounds to me like your approach has been a little bit different of buy as a primary residence, do the house hack thing. So can you kind of give us dissect a little bit what exactly is the Bur method and any pros and cons that you see to doing it the buy a primary, live in it for a while, turn it into a rental, buy another primary, turn it into a rental? Like, is there any pros and cons to these two different strategies in your eyes?
Yeah. So the Bur method is buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat. Right. So an example would be you buy a place for $100,000 that's in pretty lousy condition. You put $50,000 of rehab into it, and then it's now worth $200,000. So you've made a profit there by increasing the asset value by more than you spent to repair it. And then you refinance to pull out 150, which is all of your invested capital, and you're left with an asset with $50,000, and now you can repeat the entire exercise once again. So it's a good way to get velocity of money. The downside of the strategy, it's a great strategy, and many investors use it, and many investors should be using it because it's a great way to increase the velocity of your money. And even if you don't get all of your money out, even if you get most of your money out or a big portion of your money out, you can keep this up and buy real estate much faster. The downside of this strategy is the rehab, right? If for me, I am the CEO of Bigger Pockets. I don't have time or desire to, in my opinion, get a good risk-adjusted return on a major rehab project in my spare time because I don't have much of it. So I'm not interested in the rehab process and don't do it. The Bur strategy, to answer your question about can it be used, what's the advantage of that versus buying a property and doing it? I think it's the same strategy. If you buy a house, move into it, rehab it yourself, and then move out a year later, refinance, and buy another one, you could, Bur is a made up term that I think Brandon invented on Bigger Pockets. That falls under the category of Bur, in my opinion, that process that you outlined. So I think that's a form of Bur, and perhaps a much more economically advantaged one because you can use a low down payment owner occupant loan to finance your Bur rather than having to bring $1 bajillion in cash, which is the obvious impediment for new investors trying to get started.
Sure. Well, I mean, and I was also thinking about it more from perhaps a more seasoned investor or somebody who has a significant amount of capital to play with. And so there's that, okay, do I buy the $400,000 rental property with 20% down and part with $80,000? Or do I look for, an $80,000 beat up, place that needs a lot of work and then, do the recycling of the money so that you don't part full time with that 80K into the asset, essentially?
No, I love that question. I think it's a spectrum and it depends on the deal, but I am certainly farther along the lines of buying the really nice place that doesn't need a lot of work in an environment that I believe will experience high rent and price appreciation, and then maintaining an appropriate capital allocation and amount of leverage on that property over time. That would be my preferred end of the spectrum there. but I might invest in a cheaper property that produces tremendous cash flow if the numbers are just that much better.
Awesome. Well, that kind of brings me full circle back to, you talked about the 1% rule, and I'm thinking about cost of homes in Denver, for example. And it's like, okay, well, if I buy a $450,000 investment property, can I even really count on the 1% rule? Is that going to rent for $4,500? So how does that play into appreciating markets where home prices are increasing year on year, the way we've experienced in Denver and a lot of other markets in the US over the past decade?
Yeah, absolutely. So in order to invest in Denver, which I do, you have to assume that your long-term appreciation rate on both price and rent is going to be superior to that of other markets, because you can't get present-day cash flow here in Denver like you can in other markets, even though we have low property taxes relative to many other markets in the country per dollar of rent and per dollar of value here. Um, the point of cash flow in the context of that investing is to reduce risk. So when I look at this, I'm not looking for a high cash on cash return in Denver. I'm looking for a cash flow level that will ensure that I do not have to commit additional capital into my investment after I purchase it and set up my CapEx reserve. So if
Got
I
it.
buy a $400,000 triplex, that would be a dream. If I buy a $400,000 duplex, let's say, right, and that place is producing $2,600 a month in rent, right? If my mortgage is $1,500, I've got an $1,100 spread. That's principal, interest, taxes, insurance. I think that $1,100 spread is enough to cover my vacancy, my property management, and my long-term capex on a monthly basis to keep me from incurring risk. The question then is, how much cash do I need to put in order to get to that point? And if that's 50% down, I'm not going to have a good leverage ratio to get myself some good returns over time. So if I can find that property that gets me $1,000, $1,100 spread between my cash flow and the mortgage with 25% down, that's the winner for me in Denver, because I know I'm not going to have to commit capital incrementally to that property. I'll probably get some cash flow, but I'll really be able to experience that long-term appreciation rate and mortgage pay down while reducing my risk. So that's how I think about investing in property here in Denver.
Okay. So let's say someone's listening and they're in Austin, for example, which has seen the similar kind of growth that we've had. Do you advise folks look in like the path of growth? Like you're looking for those burgeoning markets that are within the 20, 30-minute commute from downtown, because that's where folks are going to be able to afford life in these kinds of markets? Or do you feel like it just is a case by case basis and there might be some kind of diamond in the rough in the city that's going to cash flow that way?
Well, you got to pick, yeah. So you got to pick your market, then you got to pick your neighborhoods that you're interested in, and then you got to decide on hyperlocal factors. So, for example, I don't know about Austin, but in Denver, there are 5 neighborhoods I like, and I invest in those neighborhoods, or I look in those neighborhoods because I see the path of progress going in those in those areas. I see government infrastructure. There's a couple of outlandish, actually, government projects going in near one of the neighborhoods I'm interested in that I don't, for life of me, understand, but I know will lead to accretion of property values there. If I'm on the ends or the areas within those neighborhoods that are closer to the big developments or the things I think there will be lots of growth in, I'm willing to reduce my spread and increase my risk on the cash flow front. If I'm farther away or in areas that are seedier or farther away from the growth, then I need a bigger spread on the cash flow front to compensate for that. And that's a range that investors will have to choose for themselves in their various markets.
Cool. All right. That's super interesting. Okay. So last question I have for you, because here you are, talking about, writing about, speaking about the early retirement opportunity, but you're also the CEO. So what does the future look like for you in the way of, does it even feel like a job? Because it sounds to me like you just love what you do and you're in the right place for you career wise, but like, what does that mean to be early retirement as a goal?
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question. So the goal was early retirement when I started out, and I could very easily retire right now between my rental property income, my dividends, the interest rate I have on savings, and my book income, and the ownership I have in bigger pockets, and all of those assets. I could easily retire and cash flow my life, and probably a reasonably good upper middle class life. However, I'm now stuck, quote unquote, in my job for other reasons, right? I love the brand Bigger Pockets and helping grow that. I feel like we're the good guys in the real estate space, and we're helping people achieve financial freedom early in life. That mission, when you help people achieve financial freedom early in life, I think they go on downstream to start businesses, positively impact society, become politicians, start nonprofits, just be happier and healthier. And I think that's the mechanism that we're all in this financial independence community working towards, whether they articulate it like that or not. That's the why behind all this. So there's that mission and the users. Then I have investors who have, who are looking to me to help ensure their investment with Bigger Pockets goes well. And then we have employees here who have their careers on that. So for completely non-financial reasons, I am stuck here as the CEO of Bigger Pockets until further notice, and I love it. So,
well, preach it. That was really eloquently said, and I love it. And you guys are doing amazing things, and I don't think anyone who follows you could disagree with that mission statement. You're exemplifying it extraordinarily well. So I appreciate you all at Bigger Pockets, and I appreciate you, Scott, for taking the time to share your abundant wisdom with us today. And I hope that the listeners leave this interview as inspired as I am to get out there and keep going on the journey. If folks want to follow you, find you, connect with you, what's the best way for people to find Scott?
Sure. You can follow me on Instagram at Scott_Trench. That's probably where I'm like most responsive and active. Or on biggerpockets.com. Of course, you can just look at my user profile in the search function there. And you can listen to the Bigger Pockets Money podcast or read any of our articles or those kinds of things. So I'm generally pretty responsive and always like to hear feedback on how we can improve, or tell me if you listen to this and anything I said you disagree with or I'm wrong, because I like to continue to develop my mental models here.
I love it. I love it. Well, thank you again. And Pursuing Freedom friends, thank you as always for tuning in. And if you've listened to the show before, that I'm going to plead with you that you, if you're enjoying this content, need to leave us a review so we can continue to attract great guests like Scott and help provide this content to help you on your journey to freedom, which is what it's all about. I love and appreciate you. Make it an awesome day.